Hi, I am Professor Amitabh Banerjee, an epidemiologist and author of this book, COVID-19 Pandemic, A Third Eye. And today I'll be discussing chapter 12 of this book. The title of this chapter is It is Time to Think Slow Now. This column was written when the pandemic was very well into its course and the interventions by the world government continued as the same sprint mode. So, which I wanted to emphasize by taking examples of the how to examples from Daniel Kahnemann, who is expert on taking decisions under uncertainty, and he is the author of the book Thinking Fast and Slow. And he won the Nobel Prize in economics also. Though he was not an economist, he was more of a psychologist and a behavioral scientist. And he died just recently in March 27th this year. And his book is Thinking Fast and Slow, where he is trying to compare what lessons we could have taken from his strategy of thinking under uncertainty. Governments took the pandemic for a sprint event where unthinking speed was the essence. It is turning out to be a marathon which demands stamina, endurance, and planning, and of course, slow thinking. Why we are not achieving what we are. Nobel laureate Daniel Kahnemann coined the phrase thinking fast and slow. Thinking fast is intuitive and effortless, while thinking slow is deliberate and calls for effort. After thinking fast, taking time out for thinking slow can be worthwhile. The response to the pandemic was driven by panic. Fear of imminent danger led to thinking fast. Governments were like students attempting questions out of their syllabus. In the manner of unprepared students, they resorted to mass copying. Country after country copied communist China's draconian measures, the imitators outdoing the trendsetter. Fast thinking led to contradictions, as they usually do. Initially, there were conflicting messages regarding the use of face masks by the general public. The WHO also made a U-turn after announcing that asymptomatic persons do not transmit the virus. And then there was backtracking by the WHO after announcing that asymptomatic people need not be tested. None of these statements are right or wrong, but need to be considered in proper context. Pandemic evolves in stages. What is applicable in one region at one time may not be applicable in another region, which may be in a different stage of the pandemic. Responding to disease outbreaks is a dynamic process like driving a car. Taking off from a stationary position, one has to engage the fuel-intensive first gear. Once on the run, fuel is preserved by engaging top gears. At the end of the drive, once again fuel-intensive lower gears are used. Outbreak response also follows a similar sequence. Intensive containment measures should be applied when the outbreak starts to take off, once the outbreak breaks into community transmission. Intensive containment measures are not very cost effective. The strategy at this stage should change gears to control fatalities by ensuring early management of cases, leaving the asymptomatic well alone. When the disease is on the verge of eradication, again, containment measures such as test, trace, and isolation becomes important and would include testing of asymptomatic contacts as well. That is when we are on the last stage of disease eradication. And this, of course, any disease eradication is very, very resource intensive. So one has to again take a call whether it is worth eradicating. Because as we saw now, COVID has become very mild. So there is no, it won't be cost benefit to go for eradication. So anyways, at least we, unfortunately, strangely, it appears that the except for the effortless, panic-driven, fast-thinking responses responses by most countries, what was lacking was deliberate slow thinking to consider the stage of the pandemic in a particular region to enable calibration of the response. We kept driving in the first intensive gear throughout the pandemic. The sprint is long over. It is time to abandon fast thinking. Currently, we are running a marathon. It is time for second wind and some thinking slow. Having lost the sprint, we should endeavor to win the marathon. To be successful, we should let go of the measures which were appropriate for the sprint and adopt measures appropriate for a marathon. This was written when the pandemic was still going on, second wave, third wave, that type of thing. Now, of course, being well into community transmission, containment measures such as intensive testing and tracing, particularly of asymptomatic, should be abandoned. It makes no sense for requiring RT-PCR tests for interstate travel either. Long after the community transmission had settled, uh, requirement for RT-PCR restriction of movements continued. Quarantine continued. This will go a long way in allaying the fear and stigma of the disease. Another important step should be proper risk communication to the people. The modus operandi of most governments has been to instill fear in people. So they also go into panic and think fast to make them comply to the so-called COVID appropriate behavior. And now most of the COVID appropriate behavior were not based on science, as even admitted by Anthony Fauci in Senate hearing. Without proper risk communication, most COVID appropriate behavior driven by fast thinking has degenerated into rituals with little impact on disease transmission. Superstars preaching and practicing this COVID appropriate behaviors have contacted the virus themselves. This should make us take a pause and appraise the evidence base for these measures. There were no evidence base, as admitted recently. One example of COVID ritualism is the advice not to step out of the house and wearing a mask if going outdoors. The origin of this guideline, as reported in New York Times, dated May 26, 2021, is interesting. The Center for Disease Control, CDC US, misinterpreted a scientific paper to conclude that the risk of outdoor transmission is 10%. In response to this misguided guideline, the corresponding author of this paper tweeted that the actual risk of outdoor transmission is 0.1%. In fact, in a tweet, she recommended to spend more time outdoors to stay healthy, mentioning that risk of outdoor transmission is negligible. So these are some of the distorted messages given by CDC. This misunderstanding led to restriction of outdoor activities worldwide because everybody follows, the world follows America. Unthinkingly. Many people who conduct businesses outdoors, such as vendors, street food, and terrace restaurant owners, could have continued to earn their livelihoods with minimum risk of transmission. Risk communication should consider COVID-19 in context. Globally, the risk of dying from infection with the virus is 0.05% in India, and globally it is 0.3% in Western countries because of the elderly population. If someone in a country catches the virus, the probability of surviving is 99.9% or more. Living exposes us to much higher risk. Daily 1,500 Indians die from tuberculosis, 400 young people die every day from road traffic accidents, and 10 times are maimed for life, and 2,000 children die daily from preventable disease, to give a quick context. So COVID is not out of context. Any disease can generate fear, panic, and fast thinking, which sometimes lead to cognitive biases. The majority of COVID-19 infections are asymptomatic, interim results released in June 2021 from a joint AIMS WHO study indicated that 60 to 70% of the population, including children, have encountered the novel virus. Other studies in some parts of the country have revealed IgG antibodies in 80% of the population. Studies worldwide indicate that natural infection give robust and long-lasting immunity, and after infection, the virus replicates and circulates in our body for 10-15 days, giving enough chance to familiarize our immune system, including long-acting memory T cells. This immune memory logically should work against variants too. We recognize people whom we had known for some time, even after gap of many years, from some residual features in their appearance. So the body T cells, memory cells also recognizes once exposed to the whole virus. The evidence and logic of not duplicating nature's efforts of natural immunity could have enabled population level immunity faster with minimum inputs by using a smart vaccination strategy. If we had excluded people with IgG antibodies, we may had to vaccinate only a fraction of the population uh, and saving lot of resources and money. And you see, besides that, anybody with a RT-PCR test positive in the past could have been excluded. So it would almost have excluded the whole Indian population. Our policymakers need to do some serious slow thinking, keeping politics and conflicts of interest at bay. Asking too much, I suppose, because the science gets a backseat, particularly when you are fighting pandemics by regulations and red tape rather than by scientific principles. And now it was not only a question of duplicating nature's efforts. India basically is a young demography. Large number of people are very young, and they were not at risk, and they are also recovered. By the time almost 80% seropositivity of country soared, only 5 or 10% vaccination was rolled out in adults, and children were not vaccinated. In spite of that, the vaccines were pushed, saying that there is something called vaccine immunity is better than natural immunity, which the science did not show that. It never. And so, and young people. So what is more unfortunate is that there are reports of certain adverse effects. However rare, it is a tragedy if even a single death occurs to the vaccine when the young person was never at risk of COVID. So one has to, in future, what is done cannot be undone. In future pandemics, there should be a team. Quick response team is good enough. They can keep thinking fast, but there should be another team, the think tank of scientists, thinking slow, deliberately avoiding the cognitive biases, avoiding the panic. So this should be the strategy in future pandemics. Unfortunately, nobody is talking of that. A pandemic means that already they are preparing for fast vaccine rollout, vaccine without knowing disease X, without knowing what disease came. Nobody is thinking there should be a think tank. It's not the preparation now is identify a new virus on one end and identify a new vaccine on the other end. And in between the gap is there. With this gap, fill in the blanks. Nobody is filling the blanks. Without this, you cannot do the slow thinking. What is the natural history of disease? What is the infection fatality rate? How it is transmitted? What are the demographics affected? So you are just still the whatever way the indications we get. And then there is a proposal of a WHO pandemic treaty, which again, the ethos is these draconian measures, rigid measures to almost convert into a police state. The science will be pushed still further. So there is a need for deliberation, debate, and discussion on these points. Thank you.